The rusty deal and the unbelievable discovery. The spaceport was noisy, filled with traders, mechanics, and scavengers looking for cheap deals. Roy Carter walked through the market, his eyes scanning the old ships and mining pods lined up for sale. He wasn't a rich man, just a simple miner trying to make a living in the asteroid belt. His last mining pod had broken down, and without a new one, he couldn't work. A man in a greasy jumpsuit waved him over. "Looking for a cheap mining pod?" he asked. Roy nodded. "Something that still works." The man grinned, showing yellow teeth. "I got just the thing. Follow me." Roy followed him to the back of the scrapyard, where an old, rusty mining pod sat under a tarp. It looked terrible: scratched metal, broken panels, and faded paint. It was probably older than Roy himself. "This piece of junk still runs?" Roy asked, raising an eyebrow. The seller chuckled nervously. "Of course. The engine is solid, just needs a little maintenance. I'll give you a good deal. Real cheap." Roy hesitated. Something felt off. The man was in a hurry to sell, and that was never a good sign. But Roy didn't have many options. He needed a pod fast, and this was all he could afford. "Fine," he said. "I'll take it." The transaction was quick, and soon Roy was flying the old mining pod back to his workshop. The controls were stiff, and the pod made strange noises, but it worked. That was all that mattered. A strange discovery. Back at his small hangar, Roy started inspecting his new purchase. He checked the engine, the control panels, and the cargo hold. There was dust everywhere, and it smelled like old metal. Then he noticed something strange. There was a locked compartment near the back, one that didn't look like it belonged in a mining pod. It had no labels, no access panel, just a solid metal door with a heavy lock. "What the hell is this?" Roy muttered. He grabbed his tools and started working on the lock. It was tougher than expected, like someone really didn't want it opened. After several minutes, the lock finally gave way with a loud click. Roy pulled the door open and stepped back in shock. Inside the compartment, curled up in a tight space, was a woman. But she wasn't human. She had smooth golden skin that shimmered under the dim lights. Her hair was long, silver, and almost seemed to glow. She wore torn, dirty clothing, and her wrists had faint red marks, like she had been tied up before. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing deep violet irises. She looked weak, exhausted. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Help. Me." Roy stared at her, his mind racing. Who was she? How did she end up inside his mining pod? Before he could ask, the woman's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed into unconsciousness. Roy cursed under his breath. He had just bought a mining pod, but instead, he had gotten something much more dangerous. He had no idea who this woman was or why she was locked up inside. But one thing was clear. Someone had been trying to hide her. And if they found out she was missing, they would come looking. The alien's story and first threat. Roy Carter stood frozen, staring at the unconscious alien woman in his mining pod's hidden compartment. His heart pounded in his chest. What had he just gotten himself into? The dim lights of his workshop flickered as he crouched down, carefully reaching for the mysterious woman. Her golden skin was smooth but covered in faint bruises, and her breathing was shallow. Whoever had locked her inside this pod hadn't treated her well. Roy ran a hand through his messy brown hair, muttering, "What the hell is going on?" He had two choices. One, he could call the authorities and turn her in. That would be the safest option. Two, he could help her. His gut told him that reporting this to the wrong people might make things worse. Someone had hidden her in that pod for a reason. If she was dangerous, why lock her up instead of killing her? And if she was a prisoner, why was she being smuggled like cargo instead of being taken to a secure facility? Too many questions, no answers. With a sigh, he carefully lifted her out of the pod and carried her to his small living quarters. She was light, much lighter than a human, as if her bones were hollow. He laid her down on the old cot in the corner and grabbed a medkit from his storage locker. He wasn't a doctor, but he had patched himself up enough times after mining accidents to know how to clean wounds. He worked quickly, cleaning the cuts on her arms and checking for broken bones. Nothing serious, just exhaustion and dehydration. After a while, her breathing steadied. Roy leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. She was beautiful, not in the traditional human sense, but in an otherworldly way. Her silver hair shimmered even in the dim light, and her facial features were delicate, almost ethereal. Then, without warning, her eyes snapped open. Deep violet irises locked onto his. In a flash, she moved, rolling off the cot and into a defensive crouch. Despite her weakened state, she was fast. Roy raised his hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "Easy there," he said. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't relax. Her breathing was heavy, her muscles tense like a cornered animal. "You are not Syndicate," she said, her voice hoarse but sharp. Roy frowned. "Syndicate? Who are they?" The woman hesitated, scanning the room like she expected someone to burst in at any moment. Roy sighed, rubbing his temples. "Okay, let's start simple. Who are you?" She hesitated again, then slowly straightened. "Calera," she said. I was a scientist." Roy raised an eyebrow. "A scientist? And someone stuffed you in a mining pod." Calera swallowed hard, looking away. "I was taken. Captured by the Syndicate." Roy sat up straighter. "Who are they?" Calera's hands clenched into fists. "A powerful criminal organization. They control trade routes, planets, and even people. They enslave weaker species, sell them to the highest bidder, or use them for experiments." Roy felt a chill crawl down his spine. Slavery still existed in deep space, but most of it was hidden, operating in the shadows. "They took you?" he asked. Calera nodded. "I was researching an energy source, something powerful. They wanted my knowledge, but when I refused to help them, they planned to sell me." She shuddered. "I don't know how, but someone managed to smuggle me out in that pod." Roy exhaled, trying to process everything. He had just wanted a cheap mining pod, and now he was tangled up in a galactic crime syndicate's business. Great, just great. Before he could respond, a warning beep echoed from his control panel. His stomach dropped. Someone was scanning his hangar. They found her. Roy jumped to his feet, rushing to the console. The scanner flashed red. An unidentified ship had entered the outer perimeter of the asteroid field where his workshop was located. Calera moved beside him, her face pale. "They found me." Roy cursed. He switched off external transmissions and powered down all unnecessary systems. Maybe if they looked from a distance, they'd think his place was abandoned. But then, a new alert appeared. Unauthorized docking attempt detected. His blood ran cold. "They're not just scanning," he whispered. "They're coming in." Calera gripped his arm. "We have to leave. Now." Roy turned to her. "I don't have a ship that can outrun them. This place is all I got." She looked around desperately, then pointed to his old mining tunnels. "What about those? Can we escape underground?" Roy hesitated. The tunnels were dangerous, half-collapsed, but they might be the only chance they had. The docking alarm blared louder. Heavy boots clanked outside the hangar doors. "They're here," Roy muttered. Calera grabbed his hand. "Then we run." Roy made a split-second decision. He grabbed a flashlight, his old plasma pistol, and a small bag of supplies. Then, without another word, he led Calera toward the mining tunnels. As they disappeared into the darkness, the hangar doors burst open behind them. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the hangar. "Search the area. Find her." Roy didn't stop running. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. He was now a target. And if he wanted to survive, he had to find a way to fight back. The first encounter, escape or fight. Darkness swallowed them as Roy and Calira ran deeper into the mining tunnels. The rocky walls pressed close, the air filled with the scent of damp stone and old machinery. Roy's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows ahead. Behind them, the heavy metal doors of the hangar groaned open. Then came the sharp clanking of boots, multiple pairs, marching inside. "They're here," Calira whispered, her voice tight with fear. Roy gritted his teeth. He'd dealt with space pirates before, but a full-blown syndicate hunting party. That was a different beast. He glanced back and saw her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, her golden skin shimmering under the dim light. "Keep moving," he whispered. "These tunnels are a maze. If we get deep enough, we might lose them." They hurried forward, Roy leading the way through the twisting passageways. He knew this place like the back of his hand. He had spent years mining these rocks, carving tunnels through the asteroid. But it had been a long time since he'd been down here. And not all the tunnels were stable. A distant metallic clank echoed from behind. "Search the tunnels," a mechanical voice ordered. Roy swore under his breath. These weren't just common thugs. These were professional bounty hunters, probably enhanced with cybernetics. Faster, stronger, and deadlier than any human. He grabbed Calira's wrist and pulled her into a narrow side tunnel. "Stay quiet," he whispered. She nodded, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. A moment later, a shadow moved at the tunnel's entrance. Roy held his breath. A bounty hunter stepped into view, a massive figure in sleek black armor. His helmet had a red visor that pulsed faintly, scanning the area. A high-tech rifle was strapped to his back, but in his hands, he held a compact plasma pistol, perfect for close quarters. The bounty hunter tilted his head, his visor scanning the walls. Roy knew exactly what that meant. He was using thermal imaging. Their body heat would give them away in seconds. Roy acted fast. He grabbed a handful of small metal mining tools from his belt and flung them toward a distant passage. The metal clattered loudly, echoing through the tunnels. The bounty hunter snapped his head toward the sound and raised his pistol. Zzz. A plasma shot sizzled through the air, hitting the far wall in a flash of blue light. Roy didn't wait. He grabbed Calira's hand and ran. The bounty hunter cursed in some unknown language and bolted after them. The chase through the depths. Roy's boots pounded against the rocky floor as he sprinted through the twisting tunnels. Calira kept pace, surprisingly fast despite her earlier exhaustion. "Where does this lead?" she asked breathlessly. "There's an old supply shaft ahead," Roy said. "If we can reach it, we might have a chance to." Crack! The ground suddenly gave way beneath them. Roy barely had time to grab onto the rocky ledge as the floor crumbled. He reached for Calira, who was dangling over the edge, struggling to hold on. Below them yawned a deep chasm, the remains of an abandoned mining pit. The bounty hunter's heavy boots thundered closer. Roy's muscles strained as he pulled Calira up. Just as her feet touched solid ground, the bounty hunter appeared at the tunnel entrance. "End of the line," the hunter growled, raising his weapon. Roy shoved Calira aside and fired first. His old plasma pistol wasn't high-tech, but it was reliable. The shot slammed into the bounty hunter's shoulder, making him stumble back, but his armor absorbed most of the damage. The hunter snarled and fired back. Roy barely dodged as a plasma bolt scorched past his head, hitting the rocky wall behind him. Debris rained down. He grabbed Calira's hand again. "Jump." Her eyes widened. "What?" No time to argue. Roy pulled her with him as he leaped off the ledge. For a terrifying moment, they plummeted through the air. Then, thud. They landed on a pile of old mining crates about 20 feet below, the impact knocking the air from Roy's lungs. Above them, the bounty hunter roared in frustration. Roy groaned, rolling onto his side. His ribs ached, but nothing was broken. Calira coughed beside him, shaken but alive. "Are you insane?" she gasped. "Little bit," Roy muttered, pushing himself up. Come on, we need to keep moving. They scrambled off the crates and ran deeper into the tunnels. Above, the bounty hunter shouted into a communicator. They're heading for the lower levels. Send reinforcements. The hidden message. Roy and Calera ran until they reached a dead end. A collapsed tunnel with only one way forward. An old storage chamber. Roy yanked the rusted door open and pulled her inside. He slammed it shut, locking it from the inside. For a moment, they just stood there, catching their breath. Then Roy noticed something. A faint blue glow pulsed from Calera's hand. She followed his gaze and quickly hid it, but it was too late. What was that? Roy asked. Calera hesitated, then slowly opened her hand. A small holographic device rested in her palm. It was sleek, silver, and embedded with glowing symbols. Roy frowned. What is that? Calera swallowed hard. The reason they're after me. She pressed a button, and a tiny hologram flickered to life. Roy's breath caught. It was a map, but not just any map. It showed syndicate-controlled sectors, hidden bases, and a marked location deep in uncharted space. This is their central command, Calera whispered. If we can get this information to the right people, we could destroy them. Roy stared at her. He had thought this was just about saving her. But now he realized they were in the middle of something much bigger. A war, trust issues, and a hidden message. The dim glow of Calera's holographic map flickered in the small storage chamber. Roy stared at it, his mind racing. The Syndicate's central command, a hidden base deep in uncharted space. This wasn't just some runaway slave. They were sitting on intel that could bring down a galactic crime empire. And that meant every bounty hunter, mercenary, and syndicate soldier would be coming for them. Roy exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. You want to tell me what the hell I just risked my life for? Calera closed the device, tucking it inside her torn jumpsuit. I already told you. The syndicate wants this map. Yeah, no kidding, Roy said, pacing the room. But you left out the part where this thing could start a full-blown war. He turned to her. What's so important about that base? Calera hesitated. Roy crossed his arms. No more secrets, Calera. I need the truth. She glanced at the rusted storage door, as if making sure no one was listening. Then she met his gaze. The syndicate isn't just running smuggling routes. They've been experimenting on entire species. Genocide, genetic modification, cybernetic slavery. I was taken because I found evidence that they've been building a bioweapon. Roy felt his stomach drop. A bioweapon. She nodded. Something powerful enough to wipe out entire planets. They're testing it on my people. If we don't stop them, humanity will be next. Roy let out a slow breath. He had been expecting something bad, but not this. And this map? He asked. Calera's fingers tightened around the hidden device. It leads to their primary research facility. If we can get there, we might find proof. Expose them to the galaxy. Roy ran a hand through his messy hair, frustration boiling inside him. You're talking about taking on the biggest criminal empire in the known galaxy with what? A mining pod and a pistol. Calera's violet eyes burned with determination. I'm talking about doing the right thing. Roy let out a dry laugh. Lady, I'm just a miner. I don't do hero work. Calera stepped closer, her gaze fierce. You saved me. You didn't have to. That means something. Roy looked away, jaw tight. He had never been the selfless type, but something about her desperation, about the way she clung to this one last hope, made him hesitate. Before he could respond, a heavy impact rattled the storage door. They found them. Both of them froze. A muffled voice came from the other side. We know you're in there. Roy pulled his pistol and backed away from the door. How many? He whispered. Calera closed her eyes for a brief second, listening. Then she whispered back, at least 3. Roy swore under his breath. He glanced around the storage room. Rusted metal crates, Old mining tools, dust-covered machinery. Nothing useful. The door shuddered again, this time harder. They were trying to break in. Roy looked at Calera. "You any good with a gun?" She shook her head. "I don't fight." "Figures," Roy muttered. Another impact. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Roy spotted a ventilation shaft near the ceiling. He pointed to it. "Think you can fit through there?" Calera's eyes widened. "What about you?" "I'll distract them," Roy said. "You get out, find another way to the hangar." She hesitated. "I'm not leaving you here." Roy smirked. "Relax. I've been in worse situations." That was a lie. Before she could argue, the door exploded inward. Roy grabbed Calera and shoved her toward the vent. "Go. Now." She scrambled up, pulling herself inside just as the first syndicate soldier stepped in, rifle raised. Roy dove behind a crate as plasma fire lit up the room. The fight for survival. Roy peeked over the crate and fired twice. His old pistol wasn't fancy, but it did the job. One shot hit a soldier in the leg, sending him crashing down with a scream. The second shot missed. A blast of energy struck the crate beside him, sending metal shards flying. Roy ducked, cursing. Another soldier rushed forward. Roy barely had time to react before the guy grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Roy gasped as the wind was knocked from his lungs. The syndicate goon sneered. "You should have stayed out of this, minor." Roy gritted his teeth. "I get that a lot." Then he headbutted the guy. The soldier stumbled back, dazed. Roy took the opening and grabbed a rusted wrench from the floor, smashing it across the soldier's helmet. The bounty hunter collapsed. Roy spun around just as the third soldier raised his rifle, only to get yanked backward into the ventilation shaft. Roy blinked. Calera had pulled him in. The soldier thrashed, trying to break free, but Calera pressed her glowing hand against his temple. The man's body suddenly went limp, his eyes rolling back as he crumpled to the floor. Roy stared at her. What the hell was that? Calera was breathing heavily. A neural disruptor technique. Temporary. Roy let out a low whistle. "You could have mentioned you had superpowers." She shook her head. "It only works at close range, and it drains my energy. I can't use it often." Roy nodded, impressed despite himself. "Still, not bad." She glanced at him. "Are you okay?" Roy rolled his sore shoulder. "I've had worse." They didn't have time to rest. More footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Calera looked toward the shaft. "We need to go." Roy took one last glance at the unconscious soldiers, then nodded. "Yeah. Let's get out of here." They climbed into the vent, disappearing into the darkness. A desperate plan. Crawling through the tight passage, Roy whispered, "All right, genius. What now?" Calera took a deep breath. "We need a ship." Roy snorted. "Yeah, I figured that much." "There's an old cargo hauler in the scrapyard," she said. "I saw it when we arrived. If we can get to it, I can override the controls." Roy raised an eyebrow. "You can do that?" Calera smirked. "I told you, I'm a scientist." Roy chuckled. "You're full of surprises." She looked back at him, her violet eyes serious. "Roy, if we do this, there's no going back. The Syndicate will hunt us to the edge of the galaxy." Roy thought for a moment. He could still walk away, forget about all this, let Calera deal with her own problems. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't. He sighed. "Well, I was getting bored mining rocks anyway." A small smile played on Calera's lips. Roy smirked. "Let's steal a damned ship." The betrayal and the dark secret. Roy Carter had stolen many things in his lifetime. Scrap metal, spare parts, the occasional bottle of expensive liquor from clueless traders, but never an entire starship. As he crouched behind a pile of rusted crates, peering at the old cargo hauler Calera had picked out, he realized just how insane this plan was. The scrapyard was massive, stretching across the asteroid's surface like a graveyard of forgotten vessels. Old freighters, broken-down mining rigs, and abandoned transports lay in twisted heaps, their metal frames rusting under the artificial lights. The cargo hauler was one of the few ships still intact, a bulky, industrial-looking vessel with faded markings along its hull. And it was guarded. 2 syndicate mercenaries patrolled near the ramp, their rifles glowing with charged plasma. Roy sighed. Of course, it couldn't just be sitting there unguarded. Kalira knelt beside him, her silver hair shimmering faintly in the dim light. I can disable the security locks, but we need to take them out first. Roy flexed his fingers over his pistol. All right, I'll handle the guards. You get the ship ready to fly. Kalira hesitated. Be careful. Roy smirked. Always. The silent takedown. Roy moved like a shadow, creeping toward the nearest guard. Years of working in deep space mining had taught him how to be quiet, how to move without making a sound in tight spaces. The first guard stood near a pile of broken machinery, tapping something on his wrist display. Roy moved up behind him and wrapped an arm around his throat, cutting off his air. The mercenary struggled, but Roy was stronger. Within seconds, the man went limp. Roy lowered him to the ground and grabbed his rifle. 1 down. The second guard was near the ship's entrance. He hadn't noticed his missing partner yet. Roy aimed the stolen rifle and fired a single stun shot. The blast struck the guard in the chest, sending him crumpling to the ground. Roy grinned. Easy. Kalira was already at the ship's control panel, her fingers dancing over the console. Hurry up, Roy muttered as he dragged the unconscious bodies out of sight. Kalira cursed under her breath. The encryption is more advanced than I expected. Give me a minute. Roy sighed. A minute was too long. Then, a voice crackled over the scrapyard's intercom. Roy Carter, you are surrounded. Drop your weapon. Roy froze. The voice was familiar. Slowly, he turned, and his stomach dropped. The betrayal. Standing at the edge of the scrapyard, flanked by a squad of heavily armed syndicate enforcers, was Jax Teller, Roy's old friend. Jax was a tall, rugged man with a cybernetic eye that glowed a dull red. His worn-out leather jacket still had the old Deep Space Miners Guild emblem on the shoulder, the same guild Roy had once been a part of. Roy's fingers tightened around his rifle. Jax, what the hell are you doing? Jax smirked. Saving your ass. You got no idea what you've stepped into, buddy. Kalira froze beside Roy. You know him. Roy's jaw clenched. Used to. Jax sighed. Look, Carter, the syndicate doesn't want you, just the girl. Hand her over, and you can walk away. Kalira stiffened. Roy didn't move. Jax's smirk faded. Don't be stupid, man. You can't fight them. The syndicate owns half the galaxy. You think some half-broken cargo hauler is gonna save you. Roy exhaled through his nose. His brain was screaming at him to think, to find a way out. Jax took a step closer. Come on, Carter. You were never a hero. Don't start now. Roy glanced at Kalira. She looked back at him. Her violet eyes were full of fear, but also trust. Roy made his choice. He raised his rifle and shot Jax in the leg. Jax roared in pain, dropping to one knee. Run, Roy yelled. The Great Escape. Kalira sprinted up the ship's ramp. Roy fired wildly at the enforcers, forcing them to scatter. Plasma blasts hissed past his head as he raced after her. Behind him, Jax was cursing, trying to get to his feet. Open the door, Roy shouted. Kalira slapped the console. The ship's hatch sealed shut just as a wave of plasma fire slammed against it. Roy collapsed into the cockpit seat. Tell me you got this thing flying. Kalira's hands moved frantically over the controls. Engines are old, but they're functional. Hold on. The ship rumbled to life. Outside, Jax was barking orders. Do until let them take EOF. The syndicate's turret systems activated. turning toward the hauler. Kalira yanked the controls. The ship lurched upward, metal groaning as it strained against gravity. A turret fired. A plasma blast grazed the hull, sending sparks flying. Roy grabbed the comms panel and shouted, "We need more power." Kalira grit her teeth. "Then give me a second." The ship wobbled as another turret locked onto them. Roy's hands flew over the control panel, rerouting emergency power to the thrusters. "Now," he shouted. Kalira punched the engines to full throttle. The ship blasted into the sky, leaving the Syndicate forces behind. The turret fired one last desperate shot. It barely missed, searing past the hull. Then they were free. The dark secret. Roy slumped back in his seat, breathing hard. His arms ached, his pulse hammered in his ears. Kalira was still gripping the controls, her knuckles white. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Roy sighed. "I really hope you have a plan." Kalira nodded. "We head to the outer colonies. Find someone who can help." Roy frowned. "Help with what?" Kalira hesitated. Then she pulled the holographic map from her pocket and placed it on the console. The map flickered to life, showing Syndicate-controlled space, and a new marker, one that hadn't been there before. Roy's stomach tightened as he recognized the coordinates. Kalira's voice was quiet. "This isn't just a Syndicate base. It's a weapons lab." Roy's blood ran cold. "What kind of weapons?" Kalira swallowed hard. "Ones that can wipe out entire planets." Silence filled the cockpit. Roy ran a hand over his face. He had been hoping this was just another job. A quick fight, a fast escape. But now, he was in the middle of something far bigger than he ever imagined. He exhaled. "Well," he muttered, "guess we're saving the damn galaxy." The last stand. One man versus the Syndicate. The stolen cargo hauler shuddered as it tore through deep space, its worn-out thrusters barely holding together under the strain. Roy Carter sat in the cockpit, gripping the controls tighter than he ever had before. They were running out of time. Behind him, Kalira's fingers danced over the ship's navigation console. Her violet eyes were sharp, scanning the holographic map. "There," she said, pointing to a glowing red marker. "That's the Syndicate's research facility." Roy frowned at the display. The base was hidden in an asteroid field, far beyond the usual trade routes. It made sense. The Syndicate didn't want anyone finding out what they were building. Roy exhaled. "So let me get this straight. We're flying straight into an enemy stronghold, with a ship that's falling apart, against an army of bounty hunters, to stop a planet-killing weapon." Kalira's lips pressed together. "Yes." Roy grinned. "Well, at least it's a terrible idea." The ship's proximity alarms blared, cutting through the moment. Kalira's expression hardened. "They found us. The battle begins." Roy cursed and slammed the thrusters into full speed. The ship's engines roared, but they weren't built for combat. The Syndicate's patrol ships closed in fast. 3 sleek, heavily armed interceptors. "They're locking weapons," Kalira shouted. Roy gritted his teeth. He wasn't a fighter pilot, but he knew how to handle a ship. He jerked the controls, sending the hauler into a steep dive, just as the first plasma bolt screamed past the hull. The cockpit shook violently. Sparks flew from the control panels. "We can't outrun them," Kalira cried. Roy's mind raced. He needed an advantage. He scanned the asteroid field ahead. Dense, unpredictable, perfect for hiding. "Hold on," he shouted. He yanked the controls hard, steering the ship straight into the asteroid field. The Syndicate pilots hesitated, then followed. A game of death. Massive rocks tumbled around them, some the size of entire buildings. Roy weaved through them, barely avoiding collisions. The Syndicate ships were faster, but they weren't built for tight maneuvering. Roy grinned. "Come on, you bastards, follow me." One pilot got too close. His ship clipped an asteroid and exploded into a fireball. Kalira gasped. That's one down. The remaining two ships adjusted, staying on his tail. Roy gritted his teeth. He needed to lose them, or they wouldn't even make it to the Syndicate base. His eyes darted across the asteroid field. Then he saw it. A narrow gap between two spinning rocks. Too small for the Syndicate ships, but just wide enough for them. Roy pointed. "We're going through that." Kalira's eyes widened. "Are you insane?" Roy grinned. "Absolutely." He slammed the thrusters, sending the ship barreling toward the gap. The Syndicate ships hesitated for half a second, but it was too late. Roy pulled up at the last moment, skimming through the narrow passage. The first Syndicate pilot tried to follow, but miscalculated. His ship smashed into the asteroid, erupting in a fiery explosion. The final pilot pulled away, realizing the chase was over. "They're retreating," Kalira said in disbelief. Roy let out a breath. "Yeah, that's what I thought." But the victory was short-lived, because ahead of them, looming in the darkness of space, was the Syndicate's secret base, and it was heavily defended. The final infiltration. The Syndicate base sat in the hollowed-out core of an asteroid, its metallic structure blending into the rock. Dozens of turrets lined the exterior, scanning for intruders. Roy's hands tightened around the controls. How do we get past that? Kalira studied the map. "There's a maintenance dock, lightly guarded. If we can land there, we might have a chance." Roy nodded. "All right, let's make this count." He deactivated the ship's main thrusters, letting them drift toward the asteroid's shadow. If they were lucky, the base wouldn't detect them until it was too late. Seconds crawled by. Then, the alarms blared. "They see us," Kalira shouted. Roy growled. "No turning back now." The ship shook violently as the turrets opened fire. Plasma blasts ripped through space, barely missing their hull. Roy forced the ship into a sharp dive, angling toward the maintenance dock. Kalira braced herself. "We're coming in too fast." Roy ignored her. He didn't slow down. The docking bay rushed toward them. Roy yanked the controls and crash-landed straight into the hangar. The ship slid across the metal floor, sparks flying. It finally screeched to a halt just before slamming into the far wall. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Roy groaned. "Still alive." Kalira sat up, breathing hard. "Barely." Roy smirked. "Good enough." Then the hangar doors burst open, and Syndicate soldiers poured in. One man versus the Syndicate. Roy grabbed his blaster pistol and threw Kalira a small knife. She hesitated. "I told you, I don't fight." Roy grinned. "Then start learning." The first wave of Syndicate soldiers charged forward, their rifles raised. Roy didn't hesitate. He opened fire. His first shot dropped a soldier instantly. He ducked behind a crate as plasma bolts whizzed past his head. Kalira moved quickly, dodging attacks with incredible speed. A soldier lunged at her. She sidestepped, twisting his arm and slamming him into the ground. Roy whistled. "Not bad." She huffed. "I'm improvising." The battle raged on. More soldiers poured in, and Roy's ammo was running low. Then, a deep mechanical voice echoed through the hangar. "Stand down." Roy and Kalira froze. A towering figure stepped through the smoke, a Syndicate commander in advanced power armor. Roy exhaled sharply. "Oh, that's not good." The commander's red visor glowed. "You should not have come here, Carter." Roy raised his pistol. "Yeah. Well, you're about to have a really bad day." The final showdown was about to begin. Victory, but at what cost? The Syndicate commander towered over Roy and Kalira, his crimson visor glowing like a predator's eyes in the dim hangar. His armor hummed with power, each step sending an echo through the room. Behind him, more Syndicate soldiers gathered, weapons raised, ready to strike. Roy Carter tightened his grip on his blaster, though he knew it was almost empty. Beside him, Kalira clenched her fists, her violet eyes flickering with determination despite the overwhelming odds. "This is your last chance. The commander's mechanical voice boomed. "Surrender the girl. Surrender the map. And I might let you live." Roy let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? That's funny, 'cause I was about to say the same thing to you." The commander's head tilted slightly. "You're outnumbered. Outgunned. What do you think you can do, minor?" Roy smirked, leaning casually against a crate. "You ever heard of a little thing called human stubbornness?" Then, with a swift motion, he pressed a hidden button on his wrist device. Suddenly, the hangar's lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "EMP pulse," Roy whispered to Calera. "Should give us a few seconds." In the confusion, Roy fired the last of his blaster rounds, hitting the overhead fuel pipes. Flames erupted, cutting off half the Syndicate soldiers. "Go!" Roy shouted. Calera darted toward the nearest console, her fingers working fast. "I'm hacking into their security systems. I can disable the base's defenses." Roy ducked behind cover as plasma blasts lit up the dark room. He gritted his teeth. No rush or anything. The Syndicate commander's voice growled through the smoke. "You can't hide forever, Carter." Roy's heart pounded. He knew that. But he didn't need forever. He just needed a few minutes. The fight for survival. Roy peeked over his cover, spotting the commander's glowing visor. He needed a distraction. His eyes flicked to a nearby fuel container. Perfect. He grabbed a wrench from the floor, aimed carefully, and threw it with all his strength. The wrench struck the container's valve. Fuel began to leak onto the floor. Roy fired his backup blaster. One precise shot. Boom. The explosion knocked several soldiers off their feet, giving Roy time to sprint across the hangar. Calera's voice echoed in his earpiece. "Almost there." Roy grinned. "You're doing great, but I think they're getting annoyed." The commander emerged from the smoke, his armor barely scratched. He raised a massive energy weapon, aiming straight at Roy. "Goodbye, Carter." Roy's eyes widened, too late to dodge. BZZZT. A plasma bolt flew past Roy's head and hit the commander's weapon, sending it flying from his hand. Roy turned in shock to see Calera holding a blaster. She smirked. "Improvising, remember?" Roy chuckled. "I'm starting to like you." The commander roared in frustration, lunging at Roy with enhanced speed. Roy barely managed to block the incoming punch, but the force sent him crashing into a wall. Pain shot through his ribs. "Okay, that hurt," he groaned. Calera rushed forward, using her neural disruptor ability, but the commander's armor absorbed it. "You cannot defeat me," he snarled. Roy gritted his teeth. "Wanna bet?" He lunged, tackling the commander. The two grappled, trading blows. The commander's strength was overwhelming, but Roy fought with every ounce of stubbornness he had. Finally, Roy spotted a power cell embedded in the commander's armor. "Bingo," he whispered. With a final surge of effort, Roy ripped the power cell from the armor's core. The commander froze, his armor shutting down. Roy stepped back, breathing heavily. "Guess you should have paid more attention to your weak spots." The commander fell to his knees, powerless. Calera joined Roy, holding the stolen map device. "I've disabled the base's defenses. We can escape now." Roy nodded. "Let's finish this." The final blow. Calera accessed the base's mainframe, downloading the entire Syndicate database onto the map device. "We have everything," she said. "Weapons plans, slave routes, hidden bases. It's all here." Roy smirked. "Time to blow this place sky high." Calera set the base's self-destruct sequence. "We have 10 minutes. "More than enough," Roy replied. They sprinted through the corridors, dodging Syndicate reinforcements. Roy's mind was racing. They were so close, but the Syndicate wouldn't let them go easily. As they reached the docking bay, Roy saw a familiar figure waiting for them. Jax Teller, his old friend. "Jax," Roy growled. Jax raised his hands. "Easy, Carter. I'm not here to fight." Roy aimed his blaster at him. "Then what do you want?" Jax sighed. I screwed up, all right. I thought turning you in would save my skin, but now I see what the syndicate really is. I want out. Roy narrowed his eyes. Why should I trust you? Jax pointed to a nearby ship. Because I'm giving you my ship. It's fast, armed, and already fueled. Get out of here and take them down. Roy exchanged a glance with Calera. 5 minutes left, she warned. Roy nodded. Fine, but if you double-cross me again. I won't, Jax promised. Good luck, Carter. Roy and Calera boarded Jax's ship and blasted off as the base's self-destruct countdown ticked down. As they reached a safe distance, the syndicate base exploded in a massive fireball, sending debris scattering through space. Roy slumped in his seat, exhausted. We did it. Calera nodded, her eyes filled with relief. But Roy knew this wasn't over. A new beginning. As they drifted through space, Calera activated the map device, transmitting the syndicate's secrets to every major galactic faction. Soon, news would spread. The syndicate's empire would start to crumble. Calera looked at Roy. What now? Roy smirked. Now, we keep fighting. The syndicate's not gone yet. Calera smiled softly. I'm glad you're with me. Roy chuckled. Someone's got to keep you out of trouble. The stars stretched before them, endless and full of possibilities. And Roy Carter knew one thing for certain. Humanity wasn't done yet. The fight had only just begun. To the stars. To freedom. To victory.